Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and well, this is the Moondrop Para. Para? Let's go with Para. So this is Moondrop's newest headphone, and as you've probably noticed over the past year, they've been kind of slow dripping out their own headphone line to kind of stand up with, at least ostensibly, their IM line. And while the Para is the latest, this one is a $300 planar magnetic driver headphone. And it's kind of an interesting position for a couple of reasons. One, because last year, I would say they released two headphones, and the better of the two, in my opinion, was the Moondrop Venus, which was their $600 planar headphone. Obviously, $600 is kind of a steep price for getting into the headphone game. So, well, they're here with the Para now for just $300, and I think that's a pretty good price point for a couple of reasons. One, the Moondrop Blessing is kind of like, I don't know, that's the IM that, in my opinion, kind of defines Moondrop, and price point on that is around $300 as well. And then also, I think just at this price point, $300 is in the headphone world where you start getting into some really, really good headphones, and frankly, some pretty stiff competition. You've got, of course, the Heithman Sundara, which is another planar headphone at $300, and you've got my favorite, the Sennheiser HD 600. So, well, for the past month or so, frankly, I've had the Moondrop Para, been listening to it and comparing it with some other headphones, and ready to let you know what I think about this guy. So, all right, anything that you need to know about this thing up front? I mean, there's the box if you're curious what kind of a box art you get. This is actually pretty nice looking, to be honest, but the headphone itself is what we are going to spend most of our time talking about. So let's start with the physical stuff on this headphone. I actually think I like the build on this headphone better than the build on their $600 Venus for a couple of reasons. One, aesthetically, it's a little simpler. Some people might like the more ornate design of the Venus. Personally, I like this aesthetic a little bit better. Just kind of a clean, simple design, but also unmistakably unique. I think it's a really pretty good balance, to be honest. But maybe more to the point, it just feels like a more solid build in a couple of ways. One of the things I kind of complained about with the Venus was the headband. It had like a self-adjusting headband on what do you call it, an elastic strap, and I generally like that idea. Like I like that design, but the execution on the Venus was a little bit on the cheap side. And now here, this is probably like less expensive. It's just like a flap of cloth, and it is on these connectors, which are not, self-adjusting. You got to adjust them yourself, but honestly, like, it just comes across more solid, and I actually like it, despite the fact that it's probably cheaper to manufacture. It feels better quality, in my opinion. The other thing that I think is improved on this, well, there's the aesthetic, and also just the way that the aesthetic was done on the Venus. It kind of gave it like these sharp edges to it, which you don't really get any of that here with the Para. And then the last thing I'll mention is just that all the hinges on this thing are really kind of stiff, but in a good way, actually. You can kind of see this thing doesn't flop around. If I wiggle it, okay, the headband will flop around, but you might have noticed that the cups have stayed in place. Like, it just holds its position really, really quite well. And that contributes to just making it feel like a more solid, well put together headphone than the Venus did, even though it's at half the price. So I dig that. What it does have in common is it does have the same cable. Let's see if I can give you some view of it. It's a cloth cable. I'll pull it up to the screen so you can see it up close. It's a cloth cable. It's got a slight twist here at the bottom, and honestly, I really like this cable. Moondrop has been using this cable on all of their headphones, and it might seem weird, but I'm actually a really big fan of this inexpensive cable. It's just a standard 3.5 millimeter dual entry, so you could swap it out with something else if you wanted to. But personally, like, this is a cable I've actually been putting on more expensive headphones at home, including like the Meze Lyric, just because I think it's such a nice cable. It's lightweight, it behaves well. It is maybe a little bit microphonic, but mostly I only encounter the microphonics when rubbing up against the top end of it. Fortunately, if any of the rubbing on my clothes, it happens from the bottom part. It doesn't seem to get transmitted up to the cup, so I don't know, not really bothered by the microphonics on this, to be honest. I guess the last thing I'll mention while we're talking about the cable, and I think this is a mild improvement over the Venus, is that the cable is slightly angled outward. I don't know if I can really illustrate that well, but this is the front of the headphone, and you can kind of see that the cable is slightly angled outward, and that just prevents the cable from touching your shoulders as you kind of turn left to right. And it's not as aggressively forward as some headphones are, so maybe it won't do as good a job of avoiding touching your shoulders, but has not been a problem at all for me. Now, all right, wearing this headphone, what is it like? I will say that it is somewhat of a heavy headphone. I think it weighs around 500 grams. I don't have my scale handy to validate that myself, but I would say that, yeah, it probably weighs around 450, 500 grams, which is not super lightweight, but it's also not obscene. I don't know. It's not been a problem for me, but if you're used to a headphone like the Sennheiser HD600 6XX or something like that, this is definitely going to be heavier than those. Otherwise, I don't know, the clamp pressure is pretty modest, but it's sufficient that it doesn't feel like it's loose on my head. I did find that maybe because of the looser hinges on the Venus, I found that one to be more of a tenuous grip on my head, whereas I find the Para here, honestly, just perfectly satisfactory. I haven't even really seen it on my head until now that I'm looking at myself in the camera, and it seems, it's got somewhat of a large headband up there, but do I look like a normal human being wearing this thing? I wouldn't feel too self-conscious about it. But like all these planar headphones, it is on the large side. Now, the good part of it being large is that there's plenty of room in the ear cups, although you might notice that these pads are different than the pads that were included with the Venus. Whereas the Venus, I believe, as I recall, it just had a similar or a uniform width of the pad all the way around. Here you can see the Para pads are thicker on the left and the right sides of it, and so that means that the space for your ear is not quite as voluminous as it was on the Venus. But honestly, I don't have any problems with this thing. Again, oh my gosh, bump the camera. Amateur hour here. But yeah, on my ears, like, I don't really have any issues with this thing touching my ears. Depth wise is good. My ears are not touching the drivers or anything. I have to press in pretty far. Now my ears are touching the drivers. I don't know, no complaints with that, to be perfectly honest. Yeah, generally pretty happy with the build on this headphone. Let's see if we can get this camera back into, oh my gosh, this is a professional review, I'm telling you. We're almost back in the studio, I promise you, we're so close. Okay, what else can I say about the build, physical stuff? Probably not too much, just I like the way it looks. I generally feel like this is actually better built than the Venus, and yeah, no real complaints about it. So I guess that'll get us into talking about the sound. But one other thing, okay, one quick thing to mention about the build that I forgot to mention is that this does actually come with two different sets of ear pads in the box. I didn't pull out the second set, so I can't show you, but I promise there's a second set in there, and they're actually a different design. So this is a velour pad. It's a velour on the outside and actually kind of like a PU leather here on the outside. So technically, I guess, a hybrid pad. The second set of pads that it comes with is a full PU leather, but it is fenestrated, so it's got the holes all the way across it. And not only does it contribute to a different look, which I actually have always been kind of a fan of fenestrated pads, I think they look pretty slick, but also contributes to differences in the sound, which we will talk about in a little bit. But the one thing I wanted to talk about now is just the mechanism for removing the pads. It's actually pretty nice. It's just, these things are magnetically attached. They slot in really super easy. And well, this would be like the one part of it that's not so easy and maybe does feel a little bit on the cheap side. These grills are removable. You only get one set of these. So you'd have to swap this grill from one set of pads to the other pad. And it just stretches over the edge. Can you see there? Yeah. It just stretches over the edge. And the one thing I wanted to mention is that the edges of these grills are a little bit on the sharp side. So be careful when you are swapping pads on these things, because I would not be surprised if those little metal discs could accidentally kind of start cutting a hole into the side of that pad, and probably wouldn't want that. So just be careful. I've been pretty modest with the number of times I've switched pads because I'm a little bit cautious and worried about accidentally doing that. So hasn't been a problem for me, I'll say that, but I am nonetheless a little bit concerned. Okay, let's get into talking about the sound here of the Para. And like I have been doing, we will jump over to squig.link to start diagnosing this frequency response. And I guess I'll mention the same thing I've been trying to mention every time I pull these things up. I really like frequency response graphs. Obviously, I've got squig.link. If you want to check this out, I've got it linked in the description down below. But I do want to overemphasize that I am not reviewing a graph. I am showing you the graph to kind of set the stage for what kind of sound signature we're going to get to, or we're getting with this headphone. But what I really do want to emphasize is my listening impressions and how in some ways they will often vary from what you see in a graph. So the graphs, I think, are very helpful. They're very good for predicting like getting you within the range of what you want, but in the end, you got to listen to it for yourself. But yeah, nonetheless, let's start with this graph. And honestly, what we see here is just a nice neutral sound signature, which shouldn't be surprising. Again, I mentioned that Moondrop is, I think, best defined by the Moondrop Blessing 2, a $300, very neutral, very clean sounding IM. And here with the Para, it looks like they've kind of gone for the same sound signature, but in a headphone form. And now this graph won't look like a Blessing 3 graph because it's done on a different rig and another bunch of different caveats, but just trust me, this is kind of similar to what you might expect from a Moondrop Blessing 3. It is neutral on the clean, kind of clinical side, mid-range forward, and also a little bit bright. One couple things that stand out here, at least as I graph them. One, up here up top, this treble does measure a little bit high. That was a thing that stood out to me, and a thing that was maybe somewhat surprising because when I saw Crinical's measurements, his measurements didn't really seem to indicate that. So again, take this with a bit of a grain of salt, but my measurements show the Para measuring a little bit hot up top, and then down here, down below, we just see a nice. Oh my God, I was just making sure I was using the right pads in this measurement. We have a nice linear bass. You know, there's a little bit of a dip here, but this is not as nearly as significant a dip in the bass as you would get from your typical dynamic driver headphone like the Sennheiser HD600. So just for comparison, I did also measure it with the fenestrated pads, so you can kind of see what that looks like. It does look like the fenestrated pads drop off the bass a little bit, and also smooth out the upper treble. But we'll talk about what it means in actual listening experience in a little bit. But I don't know, basically that's kind of what to expect. And if you are not familiar with my headphone target, I'll just pull up this target. This is basically a Sennheiser HD600. So if you're familiar with that headphone, and I feel like most of you should be. If you're not familiar with the Sennheiser HD600, what's up? But yeah, this is how the Moondrop Para compares to the HD600, again, at least on my rig. So that is enough faffing about with graphs. What does it actually sound like to my ear? And well, I would say, yeah, it sounds neutral. It sounds mid-forward. It is a tonally pleasant headphone, but honestly, I do think that the brightness on this can make it a little bit fatiguing after a while. It's not like it's not like a sharp brightness like you might get from, you know, certain biodynamic headphones. It's not like a ringing, like zapping sort of brightness. It's just kind of there's a little bit of an overemphasis I find in the treble. The bass does have actually some really nice tactility in it when the music takes advantage of it. Honestly, I think the bass is probably my favorite aspect of this headphone. It's just got a nice tightness to it. It does dig nice and deep. And again, if you've got that bass content in your music, I think that the Para does actually reasonably pulls it out better, reasonably better. There's a combination order of those words where that probably made sense, but it does do bass a little bit better than something like the Sennheiser HD600, in my opinion. Now, the treble, I mentioned it's a little bit hot, you know, sort of tonally, and I don't know that this is necessarily down purely to the frequency response. I try not to get too deep into that level of analysis based on the data, but I do find that the treble is also just kind of has a bit of a feathery character to it, a little bit on the swishy side. It's a little bit soft, and the definition on it is actually kind of surprisingly not that great. You know, I tend to associate planars with this kind of like a pluckiness in the treble. Certainly it's not the case with all planars. I think the Hyphaman Sundara is another planar headphone that I don't find particularly plucky. So this is definitely not unique to the Para, but I don't find the treble to be, frankly, that plucky. It's a little bit soft, a little bit undefined, again, a little bit feathery, a little bit swishy. I do find. Now, when you switch the pads to those fenestrated pads I was mentioning earlier, it does actually seem to tighten up the treble a little bit, but it also seems to add a little bit too much emphasis in sort of like the S region of vocals. I found that it added kind of a sense of wetness to the vocals, and it did also make the bass sound a little bit softer. So ultimately, I did find that I preferred personally the hybrid pads, but if you are looking for a little bit of extra definition in the treble, I do think that those fenestrated pads helped out a little bit there. Just whether or not you like the trade-offs, I guess I would leave that to you. Anything else I wanted to talk about? Not really, to be honest. Like, those are my thoughts here on the Moondrop Para. This is a pretty solid effort. I think it's really actually pretty close to being an excellent headphone. I really wanted to love this headphone for a number of reasons, not the least of which is I actually really like the way this thing looks. I love the build quality. And sound-wise, like tonally, it's in the right direction. And clearly Moondrop knows what they're doing when it comes to tuning, although I guess the Joker might be a little bit of an exception there. This is a good sign that they know what they're doing when it comes to headphones, but I do find that the treble just... it spoils the experience. So like overall, out of 5 stars, I'm gonna give the Moondrop Para a solid 3 stars. I think if you absolutely need to have a planar driver headphone in at around $300, I personally would probably still lean toward the HiFiMan Sundara, even though the Sundara is like not my favorite headphone at its price. I think it's solid. It's not super technical, but the tuning is great. It's a little bit on the warmer side versus the Para, which I find to be a little bit too bright. But if your budget is $300, frankly, still my personal favorite is going to be the Sennheiser HD 600. Of course, that said, if you're interested in checking out the Moondrop Para, of course, I've got it linked in the description down below. And shout out to Shenzhen Audio, by the way, for sending this guy in for review. I've got them linked as well. Check them out. Give them a shout out. And while you're down there in the comments or in the description, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I will catch you on the next super review, hopefully soon, not from this chair. Wait for it. All right, see ya.